Delight for me to be here with you. If you manage to make it to all of these, we'll have 4 times together. By the end of that, if you take a couple of aspirin, you'll be feeling so much better. And I've been asked and given by the students who've organized this a different question to try and deal with you every day. And so what I'll do, my utmost to do, is each time speak for roughly about half an hour on trying to answer that question. And then afterwards, I'll be hanging around, as will various other people, and we're more than happy to continue the conversation around the tables that you see here. And then, obviously, in addition, there'll be a series of evening events by Stephen. And all you need to know about Stephen is far more interesting person to listen to than me. As I was preparing this, especially given the theme of home, it was a very well-known British comedian who very sadly took his life, as so often seems to sometimes happen with people who are known to be funny and entertaining, who made the comment, "I don't know if it's possible to be nostalgic for a place that I've never known, but I think I am." In other words, he's expressing a longing to return somewhere, something that he feels he's missing, but he was never actually there. And there is a sense that you often find in often so much great literature, film, music, this sense of longing for something, potentially missing something, being apart from something. And it often sets us on a search. We find ourselves asking questions. Now, when you put the Christian faith into that mix, depending on how you view the Christian faith, you can either come at it one or two different ways, and we're going to try and cover both angles during the course of this time together, because really this set of events have been put on to allow you to explore, is this true, is it real? For one group of people, you talk about the Christian faith, you mention the person of Jesus Christ, and it just sounds too good to be true. It just sounds, wow, there must be something wrong, because this is just so wonderful. Now, for another group of people, they'll listen to it and think, this is so terrible, I can't even believe you'd want it to be true. And they breed two very different lines of inquiry and two very different types of question, both of them equally legitimate. And if there's one thing we want to do in this setting is to try to take serious questions seriously, and which is why we want to hang around and then try and engage and go backwards and forwards with you. But this whole question about, is believing in the person of Christ living in the equivalent of living in a dream world, a dream house, a pleasing fantasy, but a fantasy nonetheless, is a very, very legitimate one. And so let me see if I can say a few things about that. I don't know if any of you have read any books by Umberto Eco, a brilliant, brilliant mind, by some measures and surveys considered to be one of the most influential academic, intellectual minds of Europe of the 20th century. And not only did he write a lot of philosophy and dabble in history and all kinds of other areas, he also wrote some rather compellingly good novels too. And if you've never read any of his novels, then I would say pick one up, have a look. You're probably going to find it very, very interesting. One of his early novels was entitled The Name of the Rose, made into a film with Sean Connery. As ever, the book is better. And if you've never read the book, if you haven't come across the film, it tells the story about a couple of monks who are looking for the truth. And the truth is out there, and it can be found. It's just that it's difficult to find it, and that discovery is going to come at great cost. Now, I can't remember how much later, maybe 15, 20 years after he wrote Name of the Rose, he wrote another book called Bordellino, a different historical novel. And here, actually, truth is nowhere to be found. Without wanting to ruin the storyline for you, although I think I'm about to, in Bordellino, the hero of that book, the main character, sets off on a quest to find something using documents that he himself forged to fool other people into thinking it's true. So he actually becomes convinced of his own lie and sets off on this historical massive quest to find something using maps, letters, and everything else, all of which he himself made up. And as he sets off on this quest, he's been talking to a king, and the king can see what's happened, and he says to him, "Bordellino, you're mad. You've gone insane." He's actually convinced himself of his own lie. Now, interestingly, he also makes a prediction, a one-liner almost at the end of the novel. I think it may be the very last line in the book, where the king says to Bordellino, "What I'm concerned about is one day a greater fool will come along than you." And by that he means not just someone who will fool themselves, but someone who's able to fool everybody else into the same futile quest. So when we ask this question about, is faith irrational, we're now wrestling with two very different areas. Now, in one sense, we'll have to draw a distinction between rationality and truth. I'm going to do that now, but I'm going to just use how we use this word in a more colloquial sense for the rest of my talk. Because when you talk about being irrational, what you're basically saying is, look, what you actually believe, if you then follow the chain of reasoning from there, doesn't match up with how you're actually living and all the conclusions you've come to. In other words, you can be very rational and totally wrong. It's entirely possible. Someone once said that a madman isn't someone who's lost their reason. A madman is someone who's lost everything but their reason. So if you start from the wrong premises, then you can guarantee you'll come to the wrong conclusion, but that conclusion may be very rational given the things that you actually said you believed. One of the more controversial books I read that was published in this millennium was by a guy called Professor John Gray, who used to be professor of the history of political thought at the LSE. This is a different John Gray to the guy who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, if you're familiar with that book. And that's not the same John Gray, although he is a very popular writer. And John Gray writes as a very convinced atheist who wants to reject humanism. So what his argument is, for example, is, look, I believe in a world that has no meaning, no purpose, no truth, and all human beings are just animals. He says, in the animal kingdom, we know from our science that the strong prey on the weak. But we live in a society in the West which looks after the elderly, the vulnerable, the orphan. He says, but in the animal kingdom, it's exactly those groups which are eliminated. They don't survive. He says, so my problem, he says, is that we have a form of political economy, he's now writing as a professor of politics at the LSE, which is incompatible with our scientific convictions. I want to introduce a form of politics which is compatible with those scientific conclusions. How can we talk about human rights if there is no such category as the human? Why are we looking after all of these vulnerable groups when we should just simply eliminate them? We need to adopt a new form that is compatible. So what he's arguing for is, look, given the assumptions which I have, that a lot of people share, the form of politics I have is irrational. Does that make sense? Which is why he's arguing against all forms of humanism. He's saying if this is true, then rationally this should come about. So when you're talking about being rational or irrational in terms of our thought processes, it is entirely possible to be very rational, because I would agree with everything John Gray says, I just disagree with his premise. But given his premises, I can see how rationally he can come to the conclusion he's at. So are you following me? Some of you are looking at me thinking, we were told this might be interesting. Why did we come? Now, John Gray goes on to say in his book, Straw Dogs, he says, now, if you believe in the Christian myth and Christian mythology, then of course it makes sense to believe that you should look after the elderly, the vulnerable, and the orphan and be in favor of human rights, because you believe that there's something special about humans, that they were created in God's image, that there's something inherently valuable about them. But I don't believe that myth. He says, I think it is a myth. It should be discounted. So we have to be careful when we're talking about this subject, rational, irrational. Now, of course, most of the time when we use the word, look, they're just completely irrational, what we basically mean is what they believe isn't true. Now, that's a colloquial sense in which we use the word, and that's the way I'm going to approach the rest of what I want to say to you, even though, strictly speaking, if we want to get technically philosophical, that may not be quite so accurate to the title, but it does fit the idea of living in a dream house. You see, I remember just after I became a Christian, as my family is spread all across the world. When people ask, where am I from? There's normally this pause where I think, how do I answer that? Are you talking about my nationality, which is British? Are you talking about where I was raised, which was the Middle East? Are you talking about my parentage, which is different from that again? Whenever I speak around the world, people listen to my accent all the time, especially in England, and they're trying to figure out which part of England I'm from. And it's confusing because they can't quite place the accent. But that's easily answered because you're listening to the voice of the BBC World Service. This is the English I heard when I lived in Saudi Arabia as a child. So and after I became a Christian, sort of traveling now across all these different divergent groups, and people found out that I'd become a Christian and my life was very different to what it was before. Sometimes they would look at me if they liked me. Now, other people were much ruder to me than this, but if they liked me, they'll say something like this: Michael, I'm so happy that you've become a Christian, and I wish I could believe what you believe, but I just can't do it. Now, when you hear that in lots of different locations, it makes you think, gosh, I'm hearing people are saying that to me in Europe, they're saying it to me in the Middle East, they're saying it to me in Asia. What do you mean by it? And what I realized they were saying is, Michael, you now seem to be so genuinely happy and fulfilled as a person, I'm really happy for you. That's great. But the reason that you're just so happy is you believe in Jesus. But he's not real. Now, what do you call people who believe in things that aren't there? And the answer is mad. So what they're actually saying to me is, Michael, you are insane, but you're happy and insane. And I'm happy that you're happy. As a matter of fact, I'm so desperate to be happy myself, I too would embrace insanity just to join you. And I've been thinking about it, and I'd love to do it. I just can't. That's basically what they mean. Now, of course, what this means then is that we're defining faith in a very ahistorical way. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary introduced a new definition into its dictionary about 4 or 5 years ago that wasn't there before, which I'll come to at the moment. Because when we think of the word faith today, what we assume that means is believing something that you'd like to be true. There's just no evidence for it. That's what faith is, which is the new definition that got into the dictionaries a few years ago, but it wasn't there historically. And you go into any of the libraries here in Oxford, dig up an old dictionary, look up the word faith, and you may be surprised by how it's defined. Now, on that basis, if faith is believing in something that you'd like it to be true, but you've got no evidence, strong faith is believing something which you suspect isn't true, but you're still able to believe it, because that requires more faith, right? And the strongest possible faith you could have would be knowing it's not true and still able to believe it. I mean, that must require an enormous amount of it. Now, it is true that the Bible describes faith as a gift, but it is not the gift of stupidity. The word faith, even in the English language, all the way through the Middle English period, and indeed during the time of Chaucer and Shakespeare, faith was most predominantly used as a verb. To have faith with something was contrast to having merely believed it. To have faith meant you were persuaded it was true, you're persuaded it is real, and therefore you completely depend and rely on it. Now, I don't have time to talk to you about Spinoza and Kant and various philosophical movements and so on, but you can see this in our literature, and you can see it, and it's the only sense in which the Bible actually talks about faith. Faith has got nothing to do with what you would like to be true. It's all about what actually is true, and the question is, will you trust it or not? So in the Greek language of which the Bible was written, of which you have an English translation of the Gospel of Luke here, there are two words for faith that could be used. You have nomizzo and you have pistis. Now, nomizzo, which is used largely by classical Greeks and Hellenistic Greeks and ancient Greeks, it's a predominant word which is used, comes from the Greek nomos. It means law or custom. It means you believe something because you believe it. Well, my parents believed. Well, why did they believe? Well, my grandparents believed. Well, why did they believe? Well, my great-grandparents believed. Well, why did they believe? Look, we're Greek. That's what we do here. Okay? It just refers to your customary belief. And interestingly, in the few times this is used in the New Testament, it's used negatively. Jesus challenges it. Now, the word which is always translated faith, it doesn't matter what English translation you read, the word that's always translated faith in the New Testament is the Greek word pistis, which is from the verb pito, to be persuaded. It means, especially in a moral sense, to be sure of something or someone and to trust them. Now, this is the sense in which we use the English word even to this day. So if I were to say to you, I have faith in the British Prime Minister, you may well question my political judgment and think I've gone crazy. But when I say to you, I have faith in the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, you do not hear me saying, I wish to postulate at a metaphysical level that there is such an entity entitled British Prime Minister that I have reasons to believe actually exists. No, you don't hear me make any kind of speculation. You hear me referring to a real person, even if you don't like her, tough. She exists, and she currently holds the office. And secondly, that I think she's true to her word and her promises, the things that she said she will do. And on that basis, I feel I can trust her. I can put my faith in her. We use this word all the time in our English language, all the time. A faithful friend is someone who is true and reliable. They're there for you. You can depend on them. If we talk about someone who's broken faith with us or betrayed us, we're basically saying that they lied us or they deceived us or they pretended to be one thing when they were something else. So we still use this word in modern English today. The nearest word to maybe translate pistis, if we wanted to put it here, wouldn't so much be the idea of faith, it would be the idea of trust. Who do you trust? In the book, one of the books of the Bible called Hebrews, which is called Hebrews because it was written to a group of Hebrews, it's very inventive naming. If you get to chapter 11, if you can read as far as that, in verse 6 it says, without faith it is impossible to please God. So he's writing this letter and he's saying, hey, if you want to please God, you have to have faith. In which case, you better figure out what faith is. And very handily, that's exactly what it says. And faith is. Oh, goody, now we get the definition. So we need it to please him, so let's find out what it is. And the writer says, and faith is knowing that God is. Not wishing that he is, thinking he is, wouldn't it be nice if he is? Knowing that he is. That's a statement about reality. And he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Well, what's that about? Well, faithfulness, trustworthiness. He speaks the truth. You can rely on his promises. You can depend on him. Biblical faith, the way the word is used, is the only appropriate response to a God who is both there and who is trustworthy. So the question is he there? Can you trust him? And some of the questions I've been given, especially when I have to speak on the subject of suffering, which is obviously a very easy subject to address in 25 minutes in a comprehensive fashion, is legitimate because it raises the question, God, are you trustworthy? If you're so good, how do I see so much mess? Even if you are there, why would I rely on you? Which is why it's such an important central question. You can't trust someone if you think there's a problem with their character. If there's a problem with the character of God, even if he does exist, then we should fight against him. We certainly shouldn't trust him. We shouldn't rely on him. So this question about what is both real and what is actually ultimately trustworthy is absolutely important. It's on that basis that we make faith judgments all the time. It's on that basis we decide who do we trust? What do we trust? So faith, biblically, isn't some kind of wishful thinking. It's actually claiming to be more than that. Now, it may even be possible in a setting like this that some of you have come here as Christians and you would describe yourself that you're in the process of losing your faith. Now, here we have to be very careful because you cannot lose what you never had. So the first question becomes, when you say you're losing faith, does that mean, well, I once knew this reality in my life, I once had this relationship, I once had this dependency, and now somehow it's going away from me? Or is it rather that you're now in a setting where you're critically examining what you believe and why, and you realize it was never there? Well, no, I never knew God. I never felt I was in a relationship with him. I was never dependent on him in that sense. You can't lose what you never had. So whether you're coming to this today as a skeptic or whether you're coming as someone who wants to critically re-examine the basis of everything you think and believe, or whether you've come here as a Christian, I would encourage you, make full use of this week. It's being put on for you by the OICCU. It's part of their gift to you to create the opportunity for you to explore, is this true? Is it real? It's one of the reasons why discussion groups are going to be set up, and you'll hear more about those. There's some cards and on the table and so on, where you can actually come along and talk about some of these things, go backwards and forwards. Because there's questions of, well, is there any evidence? What type it is? Is it reliable? How do we know? All of you actually have on your table a little book called Uncover. It's actually a copy of the Gospel of Luke with QR codes in it. Needless to say, these QR codes are not part of the original text, but have been added in a little bit later so as to give you video commentary on parts of what is said. I don't know if it's still there or not, but one of the short videos on here is by a friend of mine who I know well, who's, I think he's still head of postgraduate theoretical physics at Oxford. He certainly has a chair here called Ard Louis, who comes on and explains why as a theoretical physicist he believes in a God who can perform miracles. Don't those two things somehow contravene each other? And so by all means take this away. This is one of the primary source documents in which we actually found, in which Jesus actually claims to tell us and reveal to us who he is. Why not look into it? It's worthwhile reading. So if you do want one of these, by the way, take it away, put your name in it. Stephen, who read law here and theology at the university plant from Oxford about 100 years after it got started here at Cambridge, but then saw the light and came back here, will be speaking to you, and actually he'll be speaking to you actually from this, so keep hold of it and you can put notes in it. Now, of course, some people will say, yes, but look, one of the things that makes all of this faith ridiculous is we live in such a scientific age. It's inherently untrustworthy, this whole idea of faith. They're antithetical. So let me just say a couple of words about that. There are two colleagues who I've worked with from time to time in different contexts and got to know. Both of them are professors here. One of them by the name of Alistair McGrath, the other one by the name of John Lennox. And as a matter of fact, some of their books may be available at the back of the room to take away. And they actually talk about this whole idea that somehow science has displaced the need of God in some detail. But here we have to make sure we don't make some basic category errors in the way we think. The house I live in Oxford is, well, it's relatively new because I live on New High Street in Headington. My house is a couple of 100 years old, and so it's new. It has all the original plumbing, so when you have a shower, it's like an old man dribbling on your head. It's part of the charm. That's what I tell my visitors from other parts of the world who have plumbing that works. Now, the fact that my house is still standing is actually very simple. There's nothing particularly complicated about my house. It looks like the kind of house a child would draw, door in the middle, windows either side, triangular roof. It looks like that. And it is exhaustively understood through science. There's no part of my house which is mysterious, not understood through the disciplines of mathematics and some very basic physics, and if you understand architecture, which applies those into this particular realm. It is exhaustively, completely, and totally understandable through basic science. Does that mean, therefore, we can conclude that there was no architect involved in putting it together? So we have to be very careful here. We live in a universe that is scientifically governed. Let's supposing we finally got a grand unified theory of everything. Let's assuming that we could come up with a set of mathematical principles that we could apply that understood that explained and dealt with every single aspect of existence. None of it was left unexplained. So let's imagine a totally exhaustive, scientifically rigorous understanding of how this universe works. Does that mean we can conclude that there's no mind behind it? And the answer is no, it's not capable of doing that. Because one does law and the other one does agency. In different ways, both Ard Louis, Alistair McGrath, and John Lennox all give examples of this in different ways. I won't tell you Ard Louis' one. If you want to see Professor Louis' one, I think just click on one of the QR codes that deals with miracles in here, and you can see him explain it in terms of a cup of tea. But John Lennox uses an example I absolutely love. He said, let's supposing I put a cake in front of you, and I say, what's this? And you have a biologist there, and he says, well, that's very easily explainable. And he talks about dried fruit, because this is a fruit cake, which has gone sadly out of fashion. And there's a worrying trend in the few weddings I do attend to see sponge and chocolate cakes being served at weddings rather than traditional fruit cakes, which is a talk I will give sometime next week, because it's so concerning to me, I feel it has to be addressed head on before it gets out of control. And so the biologist explains about the source of the ingredients and the processes they've been through and all this kind of stuff, and the chemist can talk about what happens when you apply heat and all the reactions that go on, and the physicist weighs in because they say all of these other two disciplines can be reduced into physics anyway, and so, of course, they can explain it. It's not complicated. There's no part of it, in which sense, that falls out of those disciplines. But let's suppose we then ask the question, why was the cake made? And now all of a sudden, a very happy-looking 12-year-old girl, my daughter Amelia, who loves baking, starts smiling, because she made it. And she is the only person who can answer that question. She's not intimidated by the physicist, the biologist, or the chemist in the room, no matter how brilliant they are, because she's the only one who knows the answer to that question. And unless she chooses to reveal it, we may never know. And when she says, well, I made it for my daddy because I love him very much, that's not an unscientific answer at all. It's just a different level of explanation. And these things actually are utterly compatible and actually fit together. So please don't buy into the idea that just because we're capable of explaining something in one way, it means that there are no other levels of explanation which are either valid, or that one form of explanation does away with the other. It's not actually capable of doing that. At a philosophical level, it cannot possibly do that. So if you're wrestling with the belief in God or the person of Christ, and your primary problem is that you're wrestling with, if you like, your philosophy of science, I'd say take some time to sit down and think about it very carefully, because it actually bears very careful consideration. So how do you find out if it's true, if it's real? Well, this is where history becomes important. This is where evidence becomes important. This is why reading some of the original source documents to say how reliable are they and what do they actually say becomes important. And that's actually why these groups have been formulated, and why there'll be the cafe running afterwards with coffee so you can sit around after table and ask those questions. If you don't get a good answer, find someone who's actually got one and come and tell me in the name, college, of the person who you were talking to who, as a Christian, was unable to answer basic, simple questions. We will sit them down and talk to them. We want to have words. In other words, look into it. I don't have time to unpack all of this now. because in a few minutes I'm going to let you go so that you can attend something called lectures, which is theoretically why many of you have actually come to this place. And we don't want to overstay our welcome and be used as an excuse for you not to do something else. But I know in my own life, having again been raised largely in a non-Christian culture, let alone in a Christian family, I suddenly came to the conclusion that the Christian faith was true. I'd been looking into it for a while, for about 6 to 9 months. I actually formulated a group of people, invited all my friends to it, and the person who ended up leading this group was a Christian, and I suddenly somehow it became a Christian group. But that was fine because I loved the conversation, and we went backwards and forwards about morality and truth and why we're here and everything else, and from time to time, who is the person of Jesus and what did the Bible say, most of which was new to me because I didn't know any of it. And then about 6, 9 months later, one day I was on my own, and I'd come to the rather disturbing conclusion that the Christian faith was true. Now, my problem is I didn't want it to be true. You see, I was very happy for them. I was just sure it wouldn't be good for me. I didn't actually do this formally in my life, but if you had asked me as a non-Christian, how was life going for you, I would have scored myself 8 out of 10, I think, maybe 9. I mean, everything was going so well. Okay, good family, good education, I was doing well, good prospects, I was very sporty, very good looking, as you can see, remarkably humble for a young guy. Everything was just going for me. And I suppose, to be perfectly honest, I felt about Christians at that time the same way I felt about communists, namely, they have nothing, but they wanted to share it with me. And but they were nice people. I was happy to talk to them. And now, all of a sudden, I'm 6 months in of asking all these difficult questions. I've actually come to the conclusion it's true. But I didn't want it to be true, because I was utterly convinced that if I was enjoying life 8 out of 10 as a non-Christian, if I became a Christian, it would go down to 2 out of 10. And so I just made the decision that I'll think about this when I'm 80. But the trouble is, the way I'm wired is that truth was always very important to me. And I just couldn't get out of my head, which is why one evening I chain-smoked my way through 40 cigarettes. So I was smoking a French filterless cigarette at the time. But that's a whole other story about why I was doing that. And at the end, just thought, I can't get around this. I'm going to have to become a Christian. And I remember finding a few of my friends that evening and sitting them down and saying, I have something very important to tell you. I said, tonight, I'm going to become a Christian, and I want you to know that from now on, I simply won't be enjoying myself anymore. And that's exactly how I felt. I felt that I was sacrificing on the altar of truth my only shot for happiness in this world. And in a rather despondent state, left those people and went and found a second group of people who were Christians, and I said, I need you to pray for me. And probably with the lowest expectation rate in the world, this is what happened. They prayed for me, and far from being sunk into a deep depression, I suddenly found myself flooded with a joy up until that point I'd never simply known. Now, some of you may have friends who've become Christians while they've been here at Oxford, or become Christians as an adult, and you're concerned about them because they seem so ridiculously happy. I mean, it's very rare you hear someone share the testimony that says, well, before I was a Christian, I was depressed and miserable. Then I met Jesus Christ, and he turned my life around. Now I'm miserable and depressed. You very rarely hear that kind of testimony. You may notice that. They normally say something very different. And that was true for me. It completely changed my life. I can remember at that point, I decided to tell no one what had happened to me because I was worried I wouldn't be able to explain it to everyone's satisfaction. Anyway, that plan didn't work very well because the very next day I met this young woman who was a model, and one of the reasons I didn't want to become a Christian. And she took one look at me and she said, Michael, you've changed. What's happened to you? And I said, well, I'm not sure I can explain it. And she said, well, try. So I said, well, I became a Christian yesterday. She said, what does that mean? I said, look, I don't know how good an answer I can give you, but the one thing I can tell you for sure is I'm not the person I used to be. And she leant over, looked at me and said, would you like to sleep with me? I remember looking back at her saying, if you'd asked me 24 hours earlier, the answer would have been yes. But today, the answer's no. And the most surprising thing about my answer to me was I didn't feel disappointed in what I just said. Faith, biblically, It's all about truth and reality. What is true? What is real? The Christian faith opens itself up to critical examination, whether it's philosophically, historically, intellectually. Does it relate to reality? Does it actually make sense? Does it work? It offers itself up to all of that. Jesus Christ isn't coming along saying, hey, believe this if you think it will make you feel better. When I became a Christian, I was convinced it will make me feel worse. Our emotional reaction is actually secondary. The first question is, what is actually true? Now, you may be sitting here thinking, so far you haven't said anything to convince me whatsoever. Well, I'm glad you came. I hope I might see you again. Take one of these. Take the magazine which various students here have told their own story about their encounter with the Christian faith. And you can give feedback. There are some postcards down there, and you can give your feedback about what's happened here this lunchtime. You may want to say something like, good idea, try and find a better speaker. You can say whatever you want. I'm going to have the handwriting analyzed. We'll track you down. I'll come see you. Give your feedback. At the very least, grab some coffee and go backwards and forwards, but why are you sure it's true? Now, maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking, I don't know. I'm just not sure, if I'm honest. I just don't know. Well, if that's where you are, then, again, just take one of those cards, drop down an email, say, look, I really would like to find out more, give it to someone, start the conversation. However, it may be possible that there are one or two of you here, and you've actually been thinking about the Christian faith for a while. This isn't the first time you've been to something like this. You've been talking to friends, you've been talking to other people, maybe you've been reading the Bible, going along to church. And you're in the position where I am, or where I was a long time ago. And you're sitting here thinking, actually, you know what? I actually think this is true. My fear that this becoming a Christian is somehow irrational is, I can see why that may not be well-founded. And you know that this is something which is very real for you. Well, if that's you, just put your email address down. Just put the word yes on the card or something else. Drop it off to one of the people who are here. We would love to talk with you and just help talk with you about what goes from there. These are the logical replies to anything like this. No, I don't know, yes. Those are the exhaustive categories. Now, there are a few people in the room who are here who are more than happy to talk to you if you would like to talk to them. So if you want to grab a cup of coffee, come back to the table and pick up the conversation. I'm going to ask if some of them could actually just stand up now, wherever you are. If you're in this room and you're happy, if you're part of the home team or you're organizing, you're one of the guests here, or you're in the CU and you're happy to talk to people, could you just stand up so they can see? So look, as you look around, here are a few people who stood up and saying, yes, that we're happy to talk to you. And if they're a long way from you, catch their eye or go and grab one of them and get them to come and speak to you. That's why they're here. They're happy to give your time. Thank you very much for doing that. And as for the rest of you, it's now my duty to thank you very much for coming. I hope this has been helpful. I trust we may see you again. Please do come along and hear Stephen tonight, who will actually be looking at every night, a different thing that Jesus Christ said, and asking that question, what does this mean? How do we actually understand it? What is the Christian faith truly about? Take advantage of this week and this opportunity to look into it for yourself. Take all the free literature you want, and hang around. One last thing, I always do this the first time I speak. This is in particular for any very convinced atheists who are here, who feel that the best thing to do at this point is to run out of the room as fastly as you can. You're actually morally obliged to stay in this room. Let me explain why. As an atheist, you believe what I'm saying is at the worst wrong and potentially dangerous and shouldn't be spread. And all the students who are here are spending their resources, money and time to actually try and spread it. If you leave the room, well, someone else will get hit instead of you. So it's time to take a hit for the team, okay? Stay behind and engage with some of them. Every so often you have to throw yourself on a grenade in order that someone else doesn't get taken out by it. It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. You've been very, very gracious in listening to what I've said.